네, 함께 해주신 여러분.
Distinguished guests, may I have your attention, please? The conference will begin shortly at 2:30. The conference has moved online to prevent the spread of the virus. Please join us on YouTube to watch the conference. The conference is streamed live on YouTube. You can watch the Korean channel on Seoul-si channel and the English channel on Seoul City official channel. So please select the channel of your choice to watch the conference. Also, the conference provides text and sign language interpreting for the underserved. I have one more announcement for the Q&A session. Please upload your questions on the YouTube chat box for the speakers to entertain your questions. So you can use the chat box function of the YouTube channel to ask the questions. We ask you to also participate in the Watch the Show Live event. Take a photo of yourself watching the conference and upload it to your SNS using the hashtag for the event and share it on the official website. 100 viewers will be picked to win coffee coupons of Starbucks. Details of the conference are available on the official website or by scanning the QR code on the screen. We will see you at 2:30. Thank you very much. Distinguished guests, welcome to the Seoul Human Rights Conference 2020. Thank you for joining us in person and online from home and abroad, despite your busy schedules. My name is Kim Kyung-mi, MC of today's conference. The Seoul Human Rights Conference 2020, which marks its 5th anniversary, has brought together experts from home and abroad to exchange vibrant ideas under the theme Human Rights in Crises and the role of Seoul Metropolitan Government. This will be a 2-day conference. Today we will have the plenary session, and we will also have a special session. Tomorrow we will have general session as well as theme session. This year's conference has moved online due to the pandemic to ensure the safety of the participants. It's a shame I cannot meet you in person, but please join us online and stay with us until the end of the conference, as we will be able to share with the larger audience the role of not only the central but also the local governments. And as I mentioned, you can watch the Korean SHRC channel or the English Seoul City official channel. So please select the channel of your choice to watch the conference. The conference also provides text and sign language interpreting for the underserved. I also have one more announcement for the Q&A session. As we have moved the conference online, please upload your questions on the YouTube chat box for the speakers to entertain your questions during the Q&A session. We also ask you to participate in the Watch the Show live event. Take a photo of yourself watching the conference and upload it to your SNS using the hashtag for the event and share it on the official website of the conference. 100 viewers will be picked to win coffee coupons of Starbucks. We ask for your participation. Details of the conference are available on the official website, or you can just scan the QR code on the screen. Also, the studio was disinfected this morning and is operated safely in accordance with the quarantine protocol. Please forgive us for keeping the masks on during the conference, as this is to comply with the quarantine protocol. When we deliver, the speakers will also wear the masks on when they deliver the presentations and talks. We will now begin the official ceremony of the Seoul Human Rights Conference 2020. First, let me introduce the VIPs who will deliver the welcome and congratulatory remarks. First, Deputy Mayor Kim Woo-young for Political Affairs at Seoul Metropolitan Government. Thank you very much for joining us today. We have with us also Vice Chairperson Kim Ki-deok of the Seoul Metropolitan Council. Thank you for your time. Next, we also have with us Mr. Han Sang-hee, Seoul Human Rights Commissioner and Professor of Law at Konkuk University. Thank you for joining us today. And thank you for joining us today despite the inconvenience caused by the pandemic. Let us first hear from Deputy Mayor Kim Woo-young of Political Affairs at Seoul Metropolitan Government for his welcome remark.
Greetings to you all, citizens. I am Woo-young Kim, Vice Mayor for Political Affairs at Seoul Metropolitan Government. To share the suffering of our citizens from COVID-19 and knowledges and experiences of human rights experts, we are now gathered here to hold the Seoul Human Rights Conference 2020. Since 2016, since the launching of this conference, we came to mark its 5th anniversary this year. And also, this year's conference is being held under the title of the Human Rights in Crisis and the Role of Seoul Metropolitan Government. The unprecedented global pandemic threatens the life of global people, and amidst the circumstance, we have come to ask the question, who should be the most impacted by the virus? And on the basis of the empathy for those underprivileged, we want to tackle this virus, and they want this opportunity to give us a chance to grow further as the governmental institution. And also women, children, and the foreign workers on the verge of underprivileged classes. Seoul Metropolitan Government would like to seek right solutions for them. Practical supports will be in place as a result, so that the human rights of our citizens would not be endangered by COVID-19. Seoul, as the representative of city of K-quarantine, is even now fighting against the virus, and on the basis of community spirit of citizens, Seoul Metropolitan Government will put forward people in need and difficulties, and we will make our utmost efforts to not to exclude them from the social safety net. Still, COVID-19 is spreading out, and many people are suffering from difficulties, but would like to ask you to keep it up so that we will win this game against the virus. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy Mayor, for the remark. We are now amidst much difficulty due to the spread of COVID-19, and I look forward to Seoul showing what it's doing in leading the initiative in the fight against the pandemic. Next, Ms. Choi Young-ae, Chairperson of the National Human Rights Commission of Korea, who wasn't able to join us today, will give a video congratulatory remark. Let us watch the video. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Choi Young-ae, Chairperson of the National Human Rights Commission of Korea. It's my pleasure to greet you with this video. Let me first express my sincere congratulations for the opening of the Seoul Human Rights Conference 2020, which celebrates its 5th anniversary. I hope the conference will encourage local governments responsible for ensuring human rights seek ways to build sustainable cities that uphold human rights and establish a cooperative network between local governments in and outside of Korea. Given that local governments are the closest governments that serve the people by interacting with and providing public services to citizens, local human rights protection system, which centers around the Human Rights Ordinance, are highly significant. To this end, the National Human Rights Commission set forth the Standard Framework Ordinance on Human Rights in 2012 and provided recommendations to local governments to enact their own ordinances. In September 2012, the Seoul Metropolitan City not only enacted the Human Rights Ordinance, which spells out the guiding principles of human rights protection, but also appointed human rights officers and founded the Seoul Metropolitan Human Rights Commission. Moreover, Seoul became the first municipality to introduce officers dedicated to citizens' human rights protection to conduct independent investigations into and remediate human rights violations. Seoul is viewed by many as a city that leads good governance in human rights by taking aggressive approaches. I believe that this is attributable to Seoul citizens' great interest for human rights. The theme of the Seoul Human Rights Conference this year is Human Rights in Crisis and the Role of Seoul Metropolitan Government. I believe the theme is very significant and timely, as our day-to-day life is now threatened by COVID-19, which swept across the world in the first half of this year. In times of crisis, human rights and safety are not mutually exclusive. The two values are mutually complementary and reinforcing. Thus, human rights-based approach and safety measures will help us overcome concerns and fears about the future and strengthen the resilience of our society. It's my sincere hope that the conference will inspire exhaustive discussions on the role of local governments in times of crisis such as this pandemic. Once again, I congratulate you on the opening of the Seoul Human Rights Conference 2020. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that remark, Ms. Choi Young-ae, Chairperson of the National Human Rights Commission of Korea. She congratulated the opening of the conference and talked about what local governments can do in times of crisis, such as this pandemic. Next, Vice Chairperson Kim Ki-duk of the Seoul Metropolitan Council will give the congratulatory remark.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, and citizens of Seoul City, nice to meet you all. My name is Kim Ki-duk, Vice Chairperson of the Seoul Metropolitan Council. The weather is getting cold, and the end of this year is nearing us. But the unprecedented crisis doesn't seem to show us its end. Rather, the third wave of COVID-19 has started in earnest, making everybody in difficult situation. During the past month, experiencing the unprecedented global pandemic, we have come to look back on what we have taken for granted up until now. The sustainable future is not just a given, but it should be tirelessly fought for. And that's what we have learned. And this process cannot be achieved with the effort of one person, but only with gathered minds and hands. And we also learned that rather than expecting someone to do something for you, you have to start acting right away. And thus, hope is born from a community spirit of putting other people before you, a mature citizenship of complying with the government's prevention guidelines and maintaining personal hygiene. And this seed will be the one making a mature human rights city. And we should keep that seed in our minds so that we can revisit the social disparity and bipolarization that have been aggravated by the crisis. And we also should think about the socially vulnerable now suffering greater difficulty. And also, so that we can tackle the bigger difficulty and sufferings from those underprivileged, we have to think about, once again, caring and considerate attitude. And embracement should be practiced. The learnings, the valuable learnings that we achieved from this crisis should be in place with action. And so Metropolitan government will do its best in line with that. In any crisis, the roles and responsibilities of Seoul Metropolitan government will be executed with the continuous support and interest and aid from the Seoul Metropolitan Council. Would like to ask you to keep this up, and we wish you a healthy and warm winter. Today, we are here to discuss the human rights in crisis and the role of Seoul Metropolitan government, and I would like to congratulate once again the holding of this conference. Thank you. Thank you very much, Vice Chairman Kim Ki-duk of Seoul Metropolitan Council, for your congratulatory remarks. Yes, I indeed wish that this conference will consider once again the underprivileged of the society with humanity and embracing spirits. Thank you.
Last but not least, Mr. Han Sang-hee, Seoul Human Rights Commissioner and Professor of Law at Konkuk University, will give the congratulatory remark. Good afternoon. My name is Han Sang-hee, Commissioner of Seoul Human Rights. It's already been a year since the COVID-19 pandemic broke out. However, it's still spreading globally. So almost 1% of the world population has now been infected by the pandemic. Vaccines are being developed and treatments are just around the corner. However, we are still witnessing up to 500,000 confirmed cases a day. It has upended our everyday life, and it has become a part of our everyday life, and a virus that defines our lives. And now, because of the pandemic, the world has completely changed, and we are here to discuss the change. Marx Weber said that when it comes to modern civilization, when it comes to the vehicles and the transportation modes, then people are not even aware how they operate. So by that, I am trying to say that our ancestors knew the principles behind every single element in their life, and thereby they were able to have a wider perspective of what was going on in their life. However, that is no longer the case, and COVID-19 has become a threat to our everyday life. So industrialization and urbanization led our lives. And we must use the pandemic to care for our neighbors and to serve the underserved people, such as the immigrants, as well as the immigrant workers in the Korean society. So it should serve as such an opportunity. And the pain brought by the pandemic should serve as an opportunity to halt our blind pursuit of development. So we have to look at the immigrant workers as well as the immigrants and the underserved people who serve as a core backbone of our society. They contribute to our society and have contributed to the growth of our society. We talk a lot about human rights. However, human rights should not end as a mere slogan. It must be a wisdom and the ethical value and moral responsibility of our everyday life. And the pandemic has brought much suffering and pain in our everyday life, and we need to use this time to look at the pain of others and to have compassion for others. So we have to raise awareness. So be it the pain that was brought by the pandemic, or be it the pain that has been staying with us for a very long time, we are suffering right now, or maybe we are now a part of the pandemic. So human rights in the times of a pandemic should look at those sides. So we have to look at the strangers and the neighbors and to put ourselves in their shoes so that we preserve and promote their human rights. So cities are called urver. The reason being we all build a city together, and that is why cities can stay beautiful even during this painful pandemic. Today's conference is to support Seoul become a city for the people by engaging people to build and share this city. So the conference will lay the ground for the caring, respecting, sharing, and uniting efforts to truly meet the productive definition of a city. And I am positive that today's conference can serve as such an opportunity. Thank you for all of those who have put this conference together. So we are tired of awaiting the end of the pandemic, and I look forward to your insights in overcoming this crisis. Congratulations on the opening of conference one more time. Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Han Sang-hee, for that remark. I very much look forward to the discussions during this conference. So we are amidst the pandemic, and I hope that we will be able to redefine human rights in this context. So that brings an end to the opening ceremony. Thank you very much, Deputy Mayor Kim Woo-young, Vice Chairman Kim Ki-deok, Commissioner Han Sang-hee, for joining us in person despite your very busy schedules. And our special gratitude also extends to Chairperson Choi Young-ae for the video message. So yes, of course, we need to promote human rights and share different case studies of respecting, protecting, and fulfilling human rights across the world. So I very much look forward to the next session. That now brings an end to the opening ceremony. The plenary session titled Inequality, Human Rights, and the Role of Local Governments in the Era of COVID-19 will soon begin. Please join us on YouTube and send us many questions. I will be back soon at 3 o'clock. Thank you. We will now have a photo session.
Music always embraces an era. It holds the time, space, and scenery of the city that we love.
Seoul is a truly special city. This trail is an old railroad track that, instead of being torn down, was completely reformed. The city has created a sense of ease and romance I had forgotten, and it surprises me every time I experience it.
You see? What another perfect reason to stay.
I moved to Seoul and now live and work here. I was very impressed with this culture that maintains original aspects while adding a new sense.
It's because empathy is what matters. People-centered values that prioritize the happiness of everyone are found across Seoul, where past traditions and the present coexist.
That warm feeling. Isn't that a great reason to live in Seoul?
I think Seoul is filled with more energy than any other city. Such energy becomes the possibilities of the future. Various attempts to connect individuals and businesses create new business opportunities, and it makes Seoul a city where creative investments are possible with advanced 5G technologies. a more creative,
more dynamic,
more refreshing,
and more passionate city.
Seoul, a special city for you and me. I saw you.
여러분, 뭐 하고 계세요? 저랑 같이 서울시 인권정책길로 산책하실래요? 서울시는 2012년 팀 단위가 아닌 과 단위의 인권 담당관을 신설하고 서울시 인권기본조례를 제정한 것을 시작으로 전국 최초 시민인권보호관 제도 도입 운영, 인권위원회 구성 운영까지 시민의 인권 보호와 증진을 위해 제도적 기반 구축에 있어 선도적인 역할을 수행해오고 있어요. 과거에 있었던 잊어서는 안 되는 우리 인권 역사의 상징적인 공간들에 이렇게 도장을 꼭 찍어놓고 그 역사를 시민들과 함께 걸으며 기억하고 있죠. 그리고 현재 일어나선 안 되는 인권 침해를 예방하기 위해 철거 현장 인권 지킴이단이 시민들 곁을 지키고 있고요. 또 서울시 행정에서 인권 침해가 있었다고 판단되는 사건에 대해 시정 권고를 할 수 있는 시민 인권 침해 구제위원회가 인권 침해로 인해 고통받는 시민의 목소리에 늘 귀 기울이고 있습니다. 든든한 시민 인권 보호관이 언제나 기다리고 있습니다. 서울시는 국내 최초로 시민이 인권 침해 및 차별 사건에 대한 결정 과정에 직접 참여할 수 있는 시민 인권 배심원제를 도입하여 시민 스스로 인권을 지킬 수 있도록 돕고 있습니다. 서울시는 각 분야 인권 전문가들과 함께 앞으로도 시민의 인권을 위해 계속 걸어나가겠습니다. 서울시는 서울 인권 컨퍼런스를 통해 모든 시민의 인권이 바로 서는 행복한 사회를 꿈꾸며 인권 행정이 나아가는 방향을 모색합니다. 함께 누리고 포용하고 참여하는 인권특별시 서울.
A city filled with joy. A city dedicated to its people, where past traditions coexist with the present. A city filled with creative business opportunities. Seoul, a special city for you and me. I saw you.
Welcome back to Seoul Human Rights Conference 2020. We will now begin the plenary session titled Inequality, Human Rights and the Role of Local Governments in the Age of COVID-19. This session aims to assess and discuss the roles and future plans of local governments in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Seoul City's Human Rights Committee will take the initiative in looking back at the topic of human rights in the context of the pandemic from the citizens' perspectives and discuss the role of local governments in times of crisis as well as pandemic. This plenary session was planned by Dr. Lee Joo-young, advisor of Seoul National University's Human Rights Center. Dr. Lee will also moderate today's session, so we look forward to in-depth discussions. Dr. Lee currently serves as VP of Korean Association of Human Rights Studies, member of the Human Rights Management Committee at KOICA, and advisor of the Human Rights Center at Seoul National University. Dr. Lee, the floor is yours. Good afternoon. As introduced, my name is Lee Joo-young, moderator of the Seoul Human Rights Conference 2020 plenary session. And as you just heard, the topic of the plenary session is Inequality, Human Rights and the Role of Local Governments in the Era of COVID-19. And as you might have guessed, we will be discussing a wide variety of topics with respect to human rights. And after the outbreak of the pandemic, I'm sure that you heard that the virus does not discriminate. However, the pandemic has a discriminate impact on the people, and many people have lost their jobs or have lost their source of income, or there's been some gap in the caring work. And as a result, people are suffering, but the level of suffering varies by people and class as well. So we are seeing aggravated inequality in society. Then what should be the role of human rights, and what should local governments do in fighting the pandemic and coming up with quarantine measures? So that is the topic of today's plenary session. Thank you very much for joining us online. We have with us 3 speakers and 5 discussants. So allow me to introduce every one of them. It's just over 1 a.m. In Canada. We have with us Professor Violeta Ignaski online. Thank you very much for joining us online despite the late hours at night. Let me wave to you. So she is joining us online, so thank you very much. We also have with us Director Kim Myung-hee of Center of Health Equity Research, and we also have with us Chairperson Han Sang-hee of Seoul Committee on Human Rights and Professor of Law at Konkuk University. And we also have with us Ms. Na-young Jung, activist women with disabilities, empathy, solidarity for HIV/AIDS human rights, Nanuri. We also have with us a senior research fellow, Jung Jae-chul of Seoul Health Foundation. We also have with us a job creation team leader, Ms. Park Mi-ja of Job Policy Division at Seongdong-gu office. And this person is a student. We have with us Ms. Park So-bin, Seoul Girls Commercial High School and Deputy Chairman of the 5th Seoul Youth Council. We also have with us Im Jae-young, who's also a student and Deputy Chairman at the 5th Seoul Youth Council. So as I mentioned, we have 3 speakers and 5 panelists. So usually when we present, we usually meet in a hotel venue or other conference rooms, but we are here in a studio, so we might have some difficulties as we go through this session, but we ask for your understanding. Now, without further ado, we would like to hear the first presentation. So we have the Human Rights Committee at Seoul Metropolitan Government, and there is this Human Rights Commission at Ontario. So we will hear from Professor Violeta Ignaski, who's Associate Professor of Philosophy at McMaster University and OHRC Commissioner at Ontario Human Rights Commission. So as I prepared for this conference, I did my own share of studies and research to find out what other cities were doing in terms of human rights. And what Ontario Human Rights Commission was doing actually grabbed my attention. And as she is Commissioner of OHRC, I very much look forward to what we need to do in terms of quarantine and making sure that no person is left behind or put in a blind spot as we address the issue of human rights and fighting the pandemic. Now the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to speak with you. Thanks to the Secretariat. It would have been my wish to be able to do this in person, but of course, if I was able to do this in person, there probably wouldn't be a reason for this discussion about the COVID pandemic and the impact on human rights. Before I begin my talk, I thought maybe just to situate this into a little bit of context, Ontario is a province in Canada, and the Ontario Human Rights Commission serves Ontarians. I'm going to try to see about my slides here. There we go. So Ontario has a Human Rights Code, and the Human Rights Code is a provincial law that was enacted in 1962 that gives everybody equal rights and opportunities without discrimination in specific social areas such as jobs, housing, services, facilities, and contracts or agreements. The preamble of the Ontario Human Rights Code, which we just call the Code, recognizes the dignity and worth of every person and provides for equal rights and opportunities. The Code's goal is to prevent discrimination and harassment of individuals and groups identified along 17 different grounds, and these include ethnicity, race, gender, disability, family status, age, sexual orientation, and others. Now, the Ontario Human Rights Commission, of which I am a commissioner, was established as an arm's-length agency of the government in 1961 to prevent discrimination and to promote and advance human rights in Ontario. The OHRC, as we call ourselves, focuses on public education and outreach. This includes e-learning, developing policies, monitoring laws, taking legal action in the public interest, and conducting public inquiries. And at any given time, we're doing all these things at once. Oh, pardon me. There we go. We have a chief commissioner, a new chief commissioner, Ina Chadha, and she leads the commission. There are currently 4 part-time commissioners, of which I am one, and a team of about 40 other persons that include policy analysts, lawyers, law students, communication advisors, researchers, and staff on the business and corporate and technology side. Now, as I heard in the opening remarks, and I can tell you the same thing we have been experiencing here, and surely others around the world are experiencing, that the issues that COVID-19 has brought to bear and has revealed to us is that it certainly engages in importance at looking at these issues through a human rights lens. The pandemic has revealed how vulnerable groups in our society do not benefit equally from public health guidance because of the precariousness of their employment or housing, their limited access to water or internet, or because they are in state care. A lot of these issues, they're not new issues, but are things certainly that have been brought to everyone's attention to a greater degree during this time. We believe a deliberate and a long-term commitment to human rights is necessary to prevent exacerbating existing vulnerabilities and inequalities in our society. The Canadian government and the Ontario government's response has included, up to date, social policies aimed at keeping people housed, reducing income inequality, guaranteeing safe jobs, helping caregivers, and releasing nonviolent prisoners back into the community. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about some of the OHRC's efforts in order to advocate for some of these policies. Throughout the pandemic, the OHRC has provided government and other duty holders with human rights guidance through releasing various policy statements, letters to government officials and ministries, public submissions, and other communications that have been made public either in newspapers or through other venues. I attach at the end of this presentation, for those of you that want further information, an Appendix B, and you could also look at our website for various informations because a lot of these letters are public and have been posted. Throughout all of these documents, the OHRC provides human rights guidance and stresses the importance of putting human rights at the center of the pandemic response, engaging with impacted communities, using evidence and data to inform decision-making and planning, and calling attention to the disproportionate impact the pandemic has on code-protected groups. From the beginning of the pandemic, early on, the OHRC implemented an internal system to identify and respond to new and evolving issues with respect to COVID-19. This includes a daily collection of COVID-19 related reports, statements, and inquiries from government, media, stakeholder organizations, Indigenous communities and organizations, and the general public. And these reports are compiled daily so that we can keep track of these. And a weekly analysis of these issues is done by a team of policy analysts and legal counsel who then propose recommendations for action to senior management. I mentioned that we have put out several policy statements, and I'll just speak to one of these that was released in April. It's the policy statement on a human rights-based approach to managing the COVID-19 pandemic. And this statement lays out the following principles. Approach preventing and treating COVID-19 as a human rights obligation. Respect the rights of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. Set strict limits on measures that infringe rights. Protect vulnerable groups. Respond to racism, ageism, ableism, and other forms of discrimination. And strengthen human rights accountability and oversight. And these principles have been applied to a range of sectors, including corrections, prison system, education, health, social services, and long-term care. And they have guided all of the guidance that we've provided. What I'd like to do next is go into a few different areas and give you some specifics to the types of guidance and advocacy that we've been doing in these areas. The first is protecting prisoners and advocating for prisoners' rights. The OHRC meets regularly, and they have been meeting regularly even before the pandemic, with government officials regarding issues in the justice and the correction system. And since the pandemic, these meetings have specifically focused on providing advice on protecting prisoners' rights, preventing transmission of COVID in the prisons, and ensuring that there is sufficient access to testing and healthcare, which have been serious challenges. To date, and early on, the government has acted on some of these recommendations of early release of prisoners who were near the end of their sentences to reduce overcrowding in jails. So we took that to be a positive step. Another piece of work that we have been engaging in over the last several months has been a critical care triage document that's been developed by an arm of the government. Back in March, a draft document was released to hospitals and healthcare providers called the Clinical Triage Protocol for a Major Surge in COVID Pandemic. This document, the purpose of this document is to provide guidance to healthcare providers for triaging access to life-saving interventions such as intensive care and ventilators in the case of a surge, and in the case that there aren't enough to go around to everyone. If that's the case, how do we decide? And of course, an important principle is to decide in a way that doesn't discriminate and doesn't violate anyone's human rights, which is certainly a difficult thing to do in this kind of scenario. But of course, it's much better to have guidance than to not have guidance. This document was drafted without any, or to our knowledge, input from human rights experts or representatives from vulnerable groups who would be mostly impacted by this. And the OHRC called on government to ensure their inclusion. This did happen. There was a consultation that did go on with various stakeholder groups. And a revised framework was recently submitted and shared confidentially with the OHRC, but has not yet been shared with human rights stakeholders. And the OHRC continues to urge the government for transparency in the process and proper consultation in both the development of this framework and in the implementation of the framework, as we know that the implementation is going to be essential to ensuring that human rights are met. In this document, certainly in the first version and in the second version, it does take into account some of these concerns that we did raise. The first being that the protection of human rights and the principle of non-discrimination must be central to the document. It must be framed in the terms of the protection of human rights. The duty to accommodate, respect for human rights and non-discrimination requires accommodation for persons with disabilities, and this is something that's very explicitly set out in our Human Rights Code. We advocated for accessibility, that the document, so it's a very long and complex document, that it must be provided in plain language, so healthcare providers at all different levels and patients and families of patients could all access this. And that leads to accountability and due process that's essential, a process that requires that patients and families are informed of their rights and that they can have input in the decision-making and that there is an appeals process. This is still, this process is still ongoing, and hopefully there will be a document in place before it's required. And obviously we hope that it won't ever be required, but if it is, we certainly hope that something's in place. Another important issue for the Ontario Human Rights Commission, this has been an important issue for years and certainly become more important during COVID, has been the collection of socio-demographic data. The OHRC has advocated for the collection and reporting of race and socio-demographic data. They've advocated for consultation with human rights experts, representatives of racialized and Indigenous communities affected by COVID-19, and for transparency in plans for consultation, data collection, and reporting. It's only once we have this data that it would allow and enable healthcare leaders to identify populations at heightened risk of infection or transmission, to efficiently deploy scarce health resources, and to ensure equal access to public health protections for all Ontarians. In June, the government announced a regulatory change, a very positive regulatory change, to mandate that all public health units in Ontario collect socio-demographic data. And the OHRC is still involved in watching this process. We take this to be a very positive step, but of course, it's important that the data is used in a way that does not legitimize stereotypes or further marginalize already marginalized communities, and so that it's used in a way to protect the vulnerable. Another very important area is education, of course. The OHRC has met with education stakeholders and groups in government to discuss urgent needs of students from code-protected groups during the pandemic, especially students with disabilities. Certainly all students have been impacted by the change in learning, either moving to online learning or dealing with some of the new protocols. And certainly this has had tremendous impact for students with disabilities, like reading disability students that used to have greater one-on-one attention. And you can imagine students that don't have access to internet, stable internet, or a computer. Makes this very, very difficult. Drawing from our principles and action documents and our stakeholder feedback, we've provided the government with specific guidance, specifically with respect to the return to school plans, the need to establish a return to school partnership table to get all the partners together to discuss the concerns and the plans going forward. And also the obligations under the code, under the Human Rights Code, for students with disabilities experiencing barriers to virtual learning and modified classrooms. I'd like to talk a little bit about our community engagement efforts, because it's a foundational principle of our work to first engage with communities that are most effective and to understand their lived experiences. And as I discussed with the critical triage report, the OHRC was instrumental in getting the necessary communities and affected communities together to discuss this. Even prior to COVID, the OHRC meets regularly with ongoing community engagement groups. I've listed them here: the Community Advisory Group, the Indigenous Reconciliation Advisory Group, the Poverty Advisory Group, the Education Advisory Group, and the Employment Advisory Group. And they have provided valuable insight on COVID-19. I'll just briefly go over some of the feedback we've received through the community engagement that we've been doing, some of the key concerns that we're hearing. And at the end of my presentation, I've attached an appendix that gives you some detailed feedback and the various issues. As we've already noted, a disproportionate impact of COVID-19 and the pandemic response on code-protected groups, including racialized people, people with disabilities, women and children, people who are undocumented, and older persons. We've heard that there are pre-existing barriers to receiving services for people with disabilities, and that these have been exacerbated by COVID-19. We've heard that current benefits are not meeting the needs of vulnerable people, that these benefits are not accessible to the precariously employed, that people with precarious immigration status and people who are experiencing homelessness also have challenges with these. Community-based service providers are having difficulty accessing personal protective equipment and other necessary resources. We've heard that government planning must include people with lived experience. And we've heard that the government's approach to vulnerability is too narrow. By focusing only on high-risk settings related to congregate care, for example, or long-term care, many marginalized groups have not been included. understanding vulnerability should stem from intersecting issues around poverty, race, gender, and status. I'd like to mention also some of the Indigenous-focused engagement we've been involved in and some of the key concerns that we're hearing, particularly around child welfare, that families are being denied access to children in care, that there's a shortage of readily available foster homes, concerns about education on reserves, concerns about the access to technology and the broadband infrastructure, food security for families reliant on school meal programs that are no longer being offered, the difficulty of transportation because of the safe social distancing measures put in place. Additional buses are needed in order to bus students to schools, the maintenance in the schools and the additional cleaning and the resources that are required, the delays in funding and the fact that the funding has not been equivalent to the provincial levels, concerns about class sizes, that there are not enough social distancing measures. It's impossible to maintain the social distancing measures and guidelines if the classrooms are very small and the class sizes are large. And this has also led to languages no longer being taught. And finally, a concern with the lack of consultation and rights violations, particularly with respect to the COVID-19 Economic Recovery Act, and also concerns about potential violations of the United Nations declarations on the rights of Indigenous peoples and the duty to consult. So I hope that this has given you some sense of the issues that the OHRC has been advocating and raising and trying to put at the forefront of government's mind in order to ensure that the human rights of all Ontarians are kept and that we combat the discrimination and the inequality under these trying times. So thank you very much, and I'd be happy to take some questions.
이그네스키 교수님께서 그 온타리오
Thank you very much, Professor Igneski. She has just mentioned that for the sake of human rights in times of COVID-19, how OHRC has been making a lot of effort. So thank you very much for giving such a wonderful presentation for 20 minutes at so early in the morning. Well, you have just mentioned a lot of recommendations made by OHRC, for example, to reduce the crowded place of correctional facilities with prisoners, and how we can maintain the non-discriminatory principles for the disabled in attributing medical resources. And also, she has touched upon what the most vulnerable group in the society against COVID-19, and they tried to figure that groups out on the basis of the collection of socio-demographic research information, but also they had to try to not to make a branding on a specific groups of Ontarians. And rights to education for students was such an important issue, in particular for students with disabilities. OHRC has recommended some policy recommendations for those students, and what was most impressive to me individually was the highlight given on the engagement of the communities in diverse sectors, including employment and social safety net. So you got the feedback from different communities so that you can understand their worries and concerns of daily lives before you recommend some policy directions to the government. It was so impressive. Well, there were lots of similarities of Korean situations. For example, in terms of the code for prevention and protection, the prevention of the infectious disease, and to protect the vulnerable group of citizens. That's what we understand as the core importance in responding to COVID-19, regardless of there are intersections of different issues of race, gender, and ethnicities. So the complicated discrimination that should be approached from diverse facets. Well, thank you very much once again for your presentation. We can open the floor for the questions, or we can also receive questions on the chatting room on YouTube, but we have received a prior question. Well, unregistered immigrants should also be granted for the right to be tested and for social support, but they are in a dead spot or blind spot for those supports. It has been in existence before the COVID-19, but it has been aggravated by the pandemic. So we have a question like this. For example, legal status of immigrants. Depending on the legal status of immigrants, in submitting or in applying for the resources or support in relation with COVID-19, is there any discrimination for those immigrants who do not have legal status? Do you have any discriminations observed in the society? And we have another question. Well, you have county government and federal government in doing quarantine activities against COVID-19. Do you have any difficulties arising from differences of perspectives of federal government and county government?
Sure, thank you. I can speak a little bit to the question of undocumented and migrant workers. It's been certainly something that we've been hearing a lot about and concerns about. And there is certainly the worry that they have urgent needs and that they're falling through the cracks because they, it's just by the nature of them being undocumented, they don't have access to the benefits and the resources that other Ontarians have. They have a problem in housing and receiving medical care because they don't have coverage in the way that the other Ontario has. They have a heightened risk of contracting COVID-19 because their working conditions, and there are certainly distinct issues facing this group of people. They're not traced the way that others can be traced, and they don't have access to important government services. So this is a particularly vulnerable group, and it's just, it's certainly one of the greatest challenges because, they don't fall within the rights in order to have the various services, but they're a vulnerable group. So it's something that the OHRC has been advocating for strongly. Certainly a need for a provincial strategy to respond, and they have been receiving care to the extent that it's been possible, but it's certainly an issue that remains, and it's a challenging one. With respect to the question about the federal government and the provincial governments and the municipal governments, we have these three different levels of government, and it can be complicated, and it's not always smooth. And they have different jurisdictions, and certainly the federal government has been very vocal and very active in trying to put together a national strategy with respect to various economic and social benefits for all Canadians. And at the level of the province has responsibility for healthcare and education and the prison system. And so we can see that these are very large and significant issues, particularly in the time of this type of a pandemic. And, again, when we have various policies of quarantining and distancing and the safety protocols, you can imagine that at all these levels, they have different regulations, and trying to communicate these in a way that isn't contradictory. Even at my university, at McMaster University, we have our own regulations. And so that individuals need to think about what their various institutional regulations are, their municipal regulations, and then at the provincial level and at the federal level. So it's not as easy as it being coordinated in a very simplistic way, but the OHRC is still trying to monitor and ensure that at least within our mandate, within Ontarians, that their rights are being met under the code.
네, 답해 주셔서 감사합니다. 또
Thank you very much for your answer. We also have another question uploaded on the chat room. You have just mentioned that children in care facilities, they are allowed only limited visits from their parents, and for the elderly as well in facilities. Amidst COVID-19, have you practiced any human rights related activities for those people, children and the elderly in facilities? There may be some children and older people quarantined in those facilities. What kind of human rights activities did you practice in the field?
Well, certainly in both of these groups, there has been significant attention for children and women. One of a big issue that has been raised has been women and children fleeing domestic violence. And we've seen an uptick in this. And because of this, more people seeking legal aid and seeking shelters, and a lack of capacity in family court system dealing with emergency cases. And so all these issues have been coalescing and making it more difficult. Shelters having to turn away people. And so, those are some of the issues that we've been hearing. What was the other one that you said about, long-term care? Well, this has been a national travesty in Canada. The deaths in our long-term care facilities of our seniors. And one of the first steps, early, at least early for us in March, was to recognize that older adults and people living in these cares are being discriminated against, and trying to advocate on these. But again, this is a case of conflicting rights and trying to figure out how to manage. There have been issues of privacy, there have been issues of care, there have been issues, and all that, trying to somehow balance the individual interests and rights of the patients against the public health concerns. And so I just think that this is something that's very complex, and it's certainly been playing out in the legal realm as well.
네, 감사합니다.
Thank you very much. Well, it's almost up for the Q&A session. It's almost 1:45 there, right? In Canada. So
이미 잠들어 계시군요.
all right, your family is asleep. I see. Well, thank you very much once again for introducing various human rights activities of OHRC at this very late at night. Well, it's unfortunate, and I know that I can't tell you keep your seat until the end of this discussion session because it's too early in the morning there. So please keep your interest in our own activities as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
네.
Thank you very much. We will now move on to the second speaker. Let me now introduce the second speaker. We have with us researcher Kim Myung-hee of the Research Institute of Public Health at the National Medical Center. She is also
the director of People's Health Institute and working for the Center for Health Equity Research.
So People's Health Institute has actually published a white paper on human rights in the context of the pandemic to examine the lives of the people amidst the pandemic and what is the role of the local government as well. So she will be talking about that today. So yes, is the floor mine? Okay. So I've been to many conference settings, but this is very new to me. And well, it feels awkward to see my face right there and speak at the same time. So I recently moved to the Research Institute of Public Health at the National Medical Center. So today I would like to talk about the results of some of the studies that I conducted with my peers. So first, let us look at the challenges posed by COVID-19. And well, in April 30th, the Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy in the U.S. has actually made some recommendations about our way forward. So at the time, it provided a pandemic wave scenarios. So whether we will see resurgence of the pandemic, or whether we will see a slow burn, or whether we will see some peaks and valleys. So number 2 was the worst scenario, and we are right in the midst of the scenario number 2. So we need to be prepared for the future, and I'm sure that you all know that this is a very challenging time for all of us. And when I was putting together the slides in October, around November or so, at the time, the pandemic was causing much difficulty to our everyday life, but the number of cases surged even recently. So we have over 600 cases daily, and now with that we have to enhance and enforce social distancing even more strictly. So of course with that we can reduce the risk of infection as everybody stays home. However, because of that, now you are under threat because you cannot make ends meet, and sometimes even with the social distancing, some people have to go out and work. So it's been about 10 months since the pandemic broke out. However, now we see so many people faced with daily challenges because they can barely pay their bills and make ends meet. So of course there are some people who weather the crisis relatively well, but there are many people who are suffering a great deal from the pandemic. So we have to look into that class. So of course, we see some of the characteristics of the prevention and control of infectious disease. So first of all, we cannot control the pandemic perfectly because of the interaction of pathogen, human, and environment. Of course, for now, we do know one thing or two about the virus, but still there are so many things that we do not know about the virus. And sometimes experts do provide some answers. However, we cannot just apply those answers in a blanket manner, and at the same time people have to follow the protocol. So that is why we need the experts, the citizens, as well as the government coming together and communicating more effectively to ensure that this works well. And I'm sure that by now you know that I can be the host, somebody else can be the host, and if let's say that the immunity level increases, then of course we can somehow protect ourselves from the infection. So we can somehow rely on herd immunity as well. But what I'm trying to say here is that we need to balance between individual and social benefits when taking social approach. At the same time, we are now at a crossroads where socio socioeconomic and biological vulnerabilities meet. So we have to address the challenge as well, and at the same time we need to ease inequality. And I'm sure that you've heard a lot about inequality aggravated in times of crisis. And because of the COVID-19, as you can see here, well, this was before the pandemic, but there was this suicide incident of a mother and two daughters in Songpa district back in 2014. So this mother was barely making ends meet and providing for their family and two daughters, but then she broke her leg, and if this was a standard case, then breaking a leg cannot really threaten your livelihood. But for this mother, the situation was different, as she had to go out there in the field and work with her own two legs. It was a physical labor. So because of that, she could not pay her bills anymore, and she killed herself with her two daughters. At the same time, on the right, you see what happened in 2016. At the time, there was an earthquake in Gyeongju, and there were some workers who were not informed of the earthquake, so they had to go to the railway to do maintenance work, and they were hit by a train, and this left two dead and two injured. So we have to understand the risk that we are faced with, and these two incidents show how vulnerable these underserved people can be in times of crisis. So now let us look at inequality amidst COVID-19. So now there is this access to healthcare issue, at the same time the infection risk. So when it comes to low-income families, they usually go to public hospitals, that there aren't that many public hospitals in Korea. And we have, as I said, a limited number of public hospitals, but they have been designated as COVID-19 hospitals. So because of that, now the underserved people have lost access to healthcare. At the same time, we've seen suspension of free treatment and door-to-door services, as well as social welfare facilities, which led to the adding up of difficulty among the underserved people. At the same time, let's say that we have this interpretation service in the public hospitals for the immigrant workers, but because of COVID-19, they're no longer receiving such services. And as you know, the difficulties go even more than that. So they are left in the blind spot. At the same time, of course, we do receive messages from the central government about what's happening with respect to COVID-19, but the immigrant workers do not understand Korean, so they do not know what's happening in terms of COVID-19 in Korea. And there was this cohort care in isolated facilities in the early stage of COVID-19 outbreak. But the immigrant workers were not quite familiar with that idea, so that violated migrant workers' right to freedom as well. So now we have to look at the high-risk population. So we have the people that have to spend more than half of working hours in contact with the public. So in healthcare welfare, we have about 1.4 million, and women account for about 79.1%. And I'm sure that this number increased after the pandemic. And for those in non-healthcare welfare sector, we have about 10.74 million people, and women account for 46.3%. So for these people, they have to be in contact with the public, and that is why they are high-risk populations. At the same time, even among the populations, as I mentioned, the more women you have in that sector, you see that the average monthly income tends to decline. So, of course, the essential work as well as caring work, are the backbone of our society. However, now women spending time in those occupations are suffering from a decline of monthly income. Now let us look at the wage workers in work benefit rate. So of course this depends on the different factors, and there is this gender difference between whether you can go on a paid leave or not, and of course you do experience a lot of discrimination based on whether you're a full-time employee or part-time employee and so forth. And now of course we are abiding to social distancing, but not everyone is safe, because although you have to stay at home, sometimes some people have to stay in shabby one room or slice rooms, or they have to spend time in communal spaces, so they are put at higher risk. So now we also have the problem of dead zones of medical services, and now we have to look into the unmet needs of the citizens in times of the crisis. So we are faced with higher risk because of the pandemic, but there are some socio-economic demands as well as care demands that are unmet right now because of COVID-19. So we have to examine that sector. Now we're looking at human rights, and we can look at in that context health as a right. So this is the right to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. This is the definition of right to health, and this is beyond receiving free healthcare services. So this includes many different elements that serve as a pillar to the right to health. So we cannot infringe the right to health. So we have to make sure that a third party does not violate my right to health. So we have to look into the different dimensions of human rights to respect and protect and fulfill human rights in healthcare sectors and settings. So of course we heard about the importance of education in Canada, and we have to really underscore that in Korea as well, because otherwise we will see negative impact going forward. So we have to ensure the right to health, and this is not just the right to a healthy life, but it extends so much more than that. So it is a comprehensive right that includes all elements that enable healthy life, and we have to look into that. So of course we do need to provide free healthcare services to people, to the underserved people, but when it comes to the people with disabilities as well as the migrant workers, we need to provide them with the right resources to direct them to the hospitals, as well as we have to provide indiscriminate information to them. At the same time, if you're sick, the government is saying you should stay home, but sometimes, these people cannot stay home because they have to go out there and make ends meet. So we have to make sure that we facilitate the process for them to enjoy their right to health. So we have to look into the three pillars: the respect, protect, and fulfill dimensions of the right to health. So as I mentioned, it must be a comprehensive approach. So I would like to make a few suggestions for the local governments. So now municipalities in Korea have a short history, and the central government plays such a huge role in Korea, and I think it was the same in the UK as well. So we can read this in the IDA report from the UK. Local governments think they have little power, but think about who has the power to stop British children from suffering and dying in car accidents. So now, what are the roles of the local governments in Korea? So let's say you wake up in the morning and you have Seoul City Hall, or you have, some of the the county halls that disappear overnight, that what would happen? We will be overwhelmed by trash on the streets. At the same time, nobody will deliver the essential services as well as goods to you. So we take sometimes the local governments for granted, but they're doing a lot of work, and they are delivering services. They're providers of services. At the same time, they plan the COVID-19 quarantine measures. At the same time, they also execute the plans, and they are sometimes employers, and at the same time, they are also influential purchasers and trusters, and they also serve the role of political leaders. And when it comes to the different health elements, they make the final decision. So the local governments have so much to do, and their scope of work is quite extensive. So if you visit some of the websites that they provide, they're doing so much. This is the website of Seoul Metropolitan government. They provide, for instance, safety and quarantine measures as well as everyday information about what you can do. But what I'm trying to say here, and some of the suggestions that I would like to make, is that the local governments should expand the scope of their programs, and these programs should be people-centric. So let's say that you have a library that closed, then people now have had they could go to, for instance, other facilities or coffee houses and so forth. And of course, shutting down some of the public facilities is important to curb the pandemic. However, because of such actions, now it was the citizens that suffered the brunt of such action. So, of course, sometimes you have to endure the risk and deliver the essential services to people. So they need to understand what's at stake here and who falls victim of such action. Now, at the end of the day, when it comes to the children or the youth, we have to apply a wider lens. And just like the Ontario case in Canada, Seoul City as well as other local governments provide guidelines, but they need to review the human rights section of those guidelines that they provide. And as previous speaker mentioned, that the Human Rights Council just did that. And at the same time, we not only need to change our mindset, but we need to strengthen our infrastructure, because our public healthcare infrastructure is too weak, too vulnerable, and we rely too much on the market when it comes to the caring system. So this is something that we need to look at. And we also need to protect the workers. So we looked at the case of Canada. We had many different stakeholders, and they engaged in the review process. And I think that we need that in Korea as well. So this should be people-centric, as I mentioned. So you can refer to my slide. So throughout the entire life course, there are different services that people require, and they also involve different elements. So of course, we have to provide the right system to fight the pandemic. At the same time, we need to take into account the health as well as the well-being of the people in the process of doing so. So let's say that we have to climb up this very challenging slope, and in the process, we have to really rely on the central government as well as local governments to come together to provide good health. So of course, in terms of public infrastructure, I have so much to say, but today I'll just say that we need more public infrastructure because we lag behind in terms of public infrastructure. And the local governments need to really assume greater responsibility in expanding public infrastructure. So that is one thing that I would like to mention today, especially when it comes to the public care services. Now, so many people in this sector are burnt out. So we have to alleviate their pain, And to be able to do so, we have to look back on what we've been doing. At the same time, I would like to mention the importance of democratic governance, because of course we cannot know everything about the pandemic. Not even the experts know everything about the pandemic. However, that is exactly why we need to engage more people in the dialogue. So we can sometimes encounter some unexpected outcomes along the way, and of course we do not devise policies to exclude the migrant workers or so forth, but sometimes unknowingly we can discriminate those people, which is why we need to engage more citizens and have a democratic governance in place. And the accountability of the government and businesses should increase, and they should also engage the civic society, and at the same time they need to share the risk. At the same time is inequality. So democracy exists as a process, not a complete goal. So we have to create a society where everybody coexists. So we have to take these into account. So in 2015 we conducted a survey during the MERS outbreak, and because of MERS, at the time the government locked down one entire village. And that was highly touted by different groups. But we did not accurately assess what was going on at that time. But that wasn't the case, and because that wasn't the case, I think that we experienced many trials and errors this time, because we didn't learn our lesson back then. And what if the next pandemic comes and hit at us? We will make the same mistake probably, so we have to get ready for that. So we need to have good governance. We need to encourage participation, and we need to seek a consensus and hold different parties accountable and make it transparent. So we need to work together, good governance. So it looks quite abstract, but we do have some examples of that. There are some examples that engage the workers in the dialogue process. And when there was this outbreak in Itaewon, there was this case when the local government engaged the sexual minorities to come together and work together to protect the community. And we need to provide language services for the different people in different communities. And that was a case of certain incidents. And when we saw the Daegu outbreak, at the time, no one was experienced for that, but the people with disability, came together to provide the manuals and develop the manuals and distribute it to the community. So we have many success cases, and we can learn from these cases to build a good governance going forward. And now, to do so, we need to have an effective communication channel, because we cannot build such a channel overnight. So we need to establish accessible channels for the vulnerable in times of health crisis. We need to identify capacity of civil society, and at the same time build a permanent coordination network. And at the same time, engage the civil society or advocates, the vulnerable in the planning, execution, and evaluation of policies and initiatives. At the same time, we need to protect and respect the activities of labor unions and labor associations to ensure that workers serve as internal auditors. And we also need to provide citizenship, civil society, and communication education to the people. Because as I mentioned, we cannot build this competency overnight, so we have to learn this. So in closing, I would like to say a few words. Of course, this is a long-distance race, so Of course, it would be nice if this was a short race and we work overnight and the pandemic is behind us. However, that is not the case. So we have to see this as a long-distance race, and we cannot sacrifice people in the process. So we have to work together and really forge solidarity with the civil society in the fight against the pandemic, and local government should take more responsibility with that. I would like to conclude my presentation. Thank you very much for that. Thank you very much for the presentation. So that was quite a heavy topic, and you just raced through your presentation. But anyway, thank you very much for the presentation. And you talked about what local governments can do in the context of human rights in fighting the pandemic. And you talked about the right to health. Of course, health matters, but it also involves, for instance, labor, housing, as well as caring and education, the different components of health. And we have to look at all the different dimensions of health. That was what you said, because this is a long-distance race. And the pandemic will not be over anytime soon. Now we experience a lack of infrastructure, especially in protecting the workers as well as the migrant workers and the education and so forth. So we need to really strengthen our infrastructure. And you also talked about the vulnerable people in fighting the pandemic. And last but not least, you also propose some ideas in the context of governance. So as we heard from Ontario's case, what are the different stakeholders doing and what roles are they playing? And we can learn from those examples in terms of what we can do to respond more effectively in the labor, as well as the sexual minority, as well as the immigrant sectors. And by taking that into consideration, we can increase the democratic governance, and that will help us address the pandemic more effectively. So I'm sure that you wanted to deep dive into your presentation, but you were pressed for time, so I understand that. But I think that the local government as well as the central governments can take these into account in coping with the upcoming challenges. Thank you very much for the presentation.
It is now time to invite the third presenter. Please hand over the remote control. And the third speaker has already delivered his congratulatory remarks. Professor Han Sang-hee, also chairperson of Seoul Committee on Human Rights. Please. Nice to meet you all. Well, let me greet you once again. I am Han Sang-hee. Well, please consider that my presentation is on the same page as the direction of the previous one. Well, the previous speaker has touched upon the human rights agenda from a broader perspective, but I would like to limit the scope of the perspective onto the local government and human rights concerns and measures taken against those issues and challenges. And the order of my presentation is as follows. I would like to touch upon, first of all, the localization of human rights and human rights in the region, and the response of Seoul Metropolitan Government, and conclusion. Seoul City has declared itself the city of human rights, having many orientations to go forward. And one of the central point is to make Seoul shared, inclusive, and participatory for all citizens living in the city. That's the motto and vision of SMG. This is just a theory which has been already touched upon by the previous speaker, so let me skip this page. And in modern times, in particular in our case with democratization, comprehensive shout-outs to resistance that have been made for the sake of well-being and the quality of life, and those kind of discourses have been in place in the society. So human rights have been reformed with a focus on living community, and so that's what we call localization of human rights or human rights in the region. And from the perspective of Human Rights City, this agenda is discussed. Well, there's politics of life living spaces emerged as human rights that shape diverse aspects of daily lives of citizens, including equality and the quality of life, and that is expanded to the agenda of human rights in local communities. And as a result, we come up with the term Human Rights City, which has different approaches from previous terms. Registered citizens, as well as non-documented city dwellers of Seoul, or workers in Seoul, these people are considered as subjects and entities of Seoul Human Rights City, and their rights should be protected by SMG. And many urban facilities and services and decision-making process will be shared with these people, and those services should be enjoyed by these people. And from that point, we will meet the term of governance that is allowed in the city where all people's rights are guaranteed. And active and positive measures to protect the human rights of city dwellers and city workers of Seoul Metropolitan government should be practiced. And you can refer to further details in other slides. And rather than having a national human rights practices, the local human rights or human rights of localization can be more practical depending on different public rights of each different local communities, and those frames will be a lot more efficient for each cities and villages. And drinking water, accommodation, and we also have heard of some cases of car accidents in the UK, and unfortunately even that belongs to the jurisdiction of central police. Anyways, the social rights, which comprise almost all areas, sectorial areas of the city, play a pivotal role to form an environment where a specific living system is formed. And depending on needs, these rights will be associated and connected so that we can establish a frame of contemplative well-being, because Seoul or local community can be a foundation for fostering human rights of localization. And also in the UN Declaration, local government should play more practical and hands-on roles than a central government, and this is what explains the mission of the role of local government to protect and promote human rights. And as local governments are related to the daily needs of citizens, they have a closer connection with the decision-making of education, housing, public health, environment, and safety. And all citizens should be embraced by the city. So, the agenda of human rights in local communities should be addressed as the core of human rights challenges. And those challenges are exacerbated by many factors, including pandemic. And the Secretary General of the UN has defined the human rights with three challenges: right to life, and right to movement, and right to health. Only after 6 months of the outbreak of COVID-19. And also he recognized the importance of maintaining and protecting rights of the underserved, such as women and children and the elderly. And he also mentioned this quote: "The virus doesn't discriminate, but its impact is discriminatory." So the way we try to overcome COVID-19 pandemic is to be rather people-oriented than to be quarantine-centered. So actually, in times of pandemic, there are many sectorial areas at the risk of being discriminated. For example, health, medical services, and confinement or controls for quarantine, and infliction on rights to freedom, and the issues of privacy protection, the disclosure of the movement of individuals. And what has not been enhanced is the unilateral banning on the gathering in person, the freedom for religious activities, and others are also one of the limitations and restrictions made from COVID-19. And economic closure also made the lives of the socially underserved people, and all accumulated discriminations will be imposed on these people. For example, homeless and people in facilities, as well as part-time workers, women, migrants, children, and other than all other areas, only for economic damages for these people, the impact of COVID-19 is the highest. And also social services for these people are at the risk of being discriminatory, and the basic level violence should also be dealt with. And every time in crisis, hatred arises. And we also have an issue to freedom, but it is not directly connected to the agenda of today's conference, so let me skip this page. And this is the detailed list of rights that we need to contemplate on in times of pandemic. For example, rights to labor, concerning the employment insecurity for non-regular workers and female workers. We already experienced the precariousness and the suppression imposed on women workers, female workers, and it is revived once again these days. So this can be the crisis of labor rights themselves, but also some PPEs are allow only limited access for female workers. But despite these discriminations, central and local governments consider the crisis of pandemic as economic crisis and as the one of employers and workers. Practically, in regions, well-being administration or social welfare administration should be in place in the middle of all administrative affairs. But with COVID-19, this foundation is shaken, and we cannot but thinking of the importance of protection for the least underserved people, like public works and meals for homeless. And these should be addressed. And the people living in crowded facilities should also be taken out of dead spots of social safety net. And there are people who can't take off their leaves from the work even if they are sick. So in terms of education with contact-free online classes, there are students with limited access to Wi-Fi network and computers who are not receiving the services of education. So face-to-face learning process is eliminated, and this exacerbates the gap and the gap of learning and the gap of receiving quality education. But for example, in Seoul, public elementary schools and private elementary schools have shown a huge gap of the quality of education during the pandemic era. And as for students from multicultural families, they had to leave the gap of this education quality. And as democratic citizens, they were deprived of chances to be educated, to be decent citizens of a society. And the care service is a lot more severe. In Korea, care services, majority of them are provided by the private sector than public sector. But with the destruction of social service network, the classes who will be in desperate need of public services will fall into the underserved class of this COVID era. And for example, child care, which was mainly accounted by public schools, have not been provided appropriately during the quarantine times, as the schools do not have appropriate networks with private care services. So we are now discussing if the education is equal and equivalent to care or not, which seems to be irrational. And before, these children were cared by their grandparents, but in the end, female workers should take care of their own kids while working. So I would call this an feminization of child care in COVID-19. And hatred comes out in crisis and fear. That's the basic grammar of hatred. And that grammar is also applied to COVID-19 times in religious groups and LGBTI. So against the fear of infection, accountability is just transferred to these minority groups, pushing them outside of the society. And during the process, their private information is divulged and they are eventually branded. And these multiple facets of hatred are reproduced by the media, while the government is not making any responses to these. But despite of all this, SMG has been trying to overcome diverse crises related to the pandemic. During the process of quarantine, probable entrants have been provided transport services, and disaster emergency facilities were under operation to make up for insufficient medical care and services. So the frame for quarantine and treatment has been in place. And as for care service, we have been operating Care SOS Center, which has been expanded to more than 20 independent regions and provinces, so that we can have a platform for a comprehensive care service. And our community care center has also been fostered for the children care in local communities. And previous care centers were rather a center for care, but the ones newly established provide a greater space for kids to run and play. But unfortunately, we only established 2 new centers of this type. With the arrival of economic crisis, the unseenly impacted class is always culture and the people working in cultural area, and they have to bear the burdens of the pandemic in an unseen area, and customized public services are provided with these people. And support for the youth has also been carried out, so that the minority group of the economy would not be excluded or discriminated. In the area of jobs, recruitment, and special type workers and freelancers are also provided with expenses for a living. And people who had to quit their jobs who had to stop their jobs temporarily without being paid also became beneficiaries of the governmental subsidies. Well, in the central government, we still have an application of 80-20 principles, and that's why local governments have very limited leeways of applying policies into the field. And in quarantine and welfare area, this applies the same. But still, despite the practical difficulties, local governments have been making their own efforts. And with the halt of school meals, a kind of meal package is provided with students for the sake of tripartite growth of farmers and providers. And also we have had a mechanism through which various stakeholders can play together. The Seoul Human Rights Commission have also added up additional efforts to its basic mission. In the beginning, emergency living expenses and the support for emergency living expenses has been provided only with Korean nationalities, but Seoul Human Rights Commission also recognized foreigners dwelling in Seoul as a subject of human rights. So through the consultation, we recommended and consulted to provide support for emergency living expenses even for foreigners dwelling in Seoul, and the official recommendation of SMG has been announced, and upon that, the subsidy has been provided with foreigners. And Gyeonggi province got the same recommendation, but the Gyeonggi province decided not to pay that subsidy. And another thing I would like to highlight is the process of test. And during the test stage, the diagnostic questions of HIV were posed, but it was for no needs. So those questions were ruled out from the list of questions for the prospect confirmed cases, and also for the sexual minorities, not for the sake of not making any discrimination or hatred against these people, the diverse measures have been made. And for those sexual minorities not shunned from the test, we have taken consideration into their minds. And for homeless people, for the most of the privileged people, their Seoul Metropolitan government has decided to carry out a research of homeless people so that they can provide a practical recommendation for the rights of those people. Public works for homeless people have been reduced due to budgetary issues, but Seoul Metropolitan government will also make a recommendation to get it back. And even during the COVID-19 times, even if it's a minimal level, but the homeless people will be able to have become able to lead their own lives. And child care is an important issue. And after holding a forum, well, it's a few hours ago that the recommendation of Seoul Metropolitan government has been produced, including soliciting the close relationship between SMG and the Seoul Human Rights Commission. And the recommendation will come out very soon. And despite of all these efforts, Seoul Human Rights Administrative Affairs of Seoul Metropolitan Government in times of COVID-19 has limitations. Well, this slide shows the limitation of local government system in times of pandemic. Well, it indicates the limitations of local governments, but it should be those of national government because pandemic is national. So local governments and the central government have overlapping work areas. or void areas of work. But what's more important is to make human rights a mainstream of all agenda of Seoul City, which has declared itself as a human rights city. But democratic communication is necessary, as presented by the previous speaker, as governance. That's one of the limitations. Within administration, we should protect human rights, but that prejudice or that deeply rooted minds should change into a new paradigm. And what's most concerning is, like OHRC has mentioned, that in response to COVID-19, the leadership value should be revisited in a more comprehensive and long-term perspective with more focuses on human rights. And within that frame, we need to establish a more comprehensive approach to human rights. And this is not only the issue of Seoul, but welfare and social services are too much dependent on human resources and medical services alike. So this is the area that we should enhance in the long term. And what matters most is that not only long-term policy plans, but also human rights agendas should engage local people so that we can have a democratic decision-making process. Well, we are not talking about a simple engagement of citizens voting and participating in a mere way, but they have to be part of contemplation over the process of recommendation or assigning right works. And as a result from those trials, as the UN Secretary General mentioned, that we will be able to overcome the COVID-19 to be better after putting an end to this war. Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Han Sang-hee. And it was a third presentation that we just had. Well, in the process of response to COVID-19, how Seoul Metropolitan government has been responded was touched upon by the professor. For example, providing emergency living expenses support and how to reduce the hatred and discrimination against the LGBTI, and also concerning childcare, he has just pointed out that the recommendation is under preparation, and in COVID-19, also accommodation for homeless and the underserved will be also ongoing, and I look forward to the achievement of these activities. And two speakers have mentioned that it is important to respond to the COVID-19 with a focus on people, and in the process of execution and decision-making process of policies, we should include the socially underserved and minorities so that we can be more efficient in responding to COVID-19, so that we can reinforce the governance, democratic governance. And that process should make the value of people revived. And there must be lots of questions to these speakers. Please upload those questions onto the chat room of the YouTube. And let us now move on to the panel discussion session with the first discussant.
So we first have, as introduced, Na Young-jung, who is an activist at Women with Disabilities Empathy Solidarity for HIV and AIDS Human Rights, Nanuri. So I'm sure that she will be talking from her own experience as an activist, how we can fight the pandemic. At the same time, I think she will focus on the role of the facilities. Yes, it's a pleasure to meet you all. Thank you very much for having me to talk about LGBTQ's experience in fighting the pandemic. So, of course, we talk a lot about HIV, AIDS people, as well as LGBTQ. We do talk about what's happening with those people. However, I think we should go beyond those people and include all the underserved people. And I hope that the conference can serve as an opportunity to do so. So today, I would like to talk about three fields. First of all is Cheongdo Daenam Hospital for the patients with a disability. And I'm sure that you know about the facility very well. The second one is what happened in Itaewon during the Itaewon Club resurgence of the virus, the discrimination against the LGBTQ people. And the third example is about the HIV/AIDS patients, as well as the public hospitals that used to provide care for the vulnerable, including the HIV and AIDS patients, at the same time the homeless people and the poor people. However, because of the medical vacuum that is happening due to COVID-19, these people are struggling. So, of course, I'm an activist for the rights of the people with disability, and I want them to be part of our society. So I think that there should be no more facilities for these people only. And the city of Seoul was at the forefront of such movement. However, now we are seeing a lot of obstacles to this movement, and this is not that much different from what's happening in Cheongdo Daenam. So there are so many people that should be living in facilities, or these not only include people with disability, and these in the nursing homes and so forth. They are denied the right to visit, and I think we should look into this. And 47% of the death in Korea due to COVID-19 are the people living in these types of facilities. At the same time, Itaewon Club also once again exposed our discrimination against the LGBTQ people, and it kind of reinforced our prejudice against these people. So Itaewon was just looked as an area, a neighborhood of the LGBTQ people to get together and to have fun. And some people said that they did not know that before, but the Itaewon outbreak, brought that to light. So we need to look into the relationship between quarantine as well as human rights. And this is a very important movement that we need to do. And of course, as I mentioned, we need to make sure that we go through the de-institution. So, and when it comes to the LGBTQ people, they have the right to have fun and to get together for fun and for entertainment. And now we saw the reframing of those neighborhoods as a high-risk neighborhood. So now these places, started to be regarded as places that undermine the quarantine efforts, and that was a problem. So I would like to mention that, of course, social distancing is a protocol that we need to follow, but those who were already institutionalized, or the people who were discriminated, they are now forced into further isolation. And now, before, what happened was that, people were declaring that they did not want to coexist with these people. So they had to live in these cohort isolation facilities. And they faced so much bias and discrimination in that process. And as we see no end to the pandemic, we have to look into the very rationale behind the existence of this cohort facilities, and how these can undermine our efforts to quarantine. So when it comes to quarantine as well as human rights, we have to strike a balance between the two. And to be able to do that, we have to look into the institutionalization of these people, which is why we need to pursue de-institution of these people, which I believe will help the quarantine. And Itaewon clubs and neighborhoods, that itself is not a problem. It has been a culture for a very long time. So how will we coexist with such neighborhoods? So we have to really look into the idea of human rights for the LGBTQ people as well. So now the local government as well as the government are doling out disaster relief emergency funds, but that has to be non-discriminatory. So of course, to revive the economy, the government has adopted various policies, but we have to focus on the right values in the process when providing support for the people, and the effect can be different according to what approach we take. So let's say that if it's not reviving the economy, but make sure that the underserved people can really stand on their own 2 feet, then we should focus on that. And I think that is the principle of human rights. So as we coped with the challenges, we created a task force team and headquarters for the LGBTQ. And in the process, we wanted to talk more about the difficulties faced with LGBTQ. So coming out of the closet really is subject to discrimination, and we worked hard to promote and raise awareness about LGBTQ, and which is why we came up with the method where people who went there after the Itaewon outbreak for testing, their anonymity was ensured, and that was the work done by us as well as the government. And when it comes to the disabled people, the messages that they receive from the government can be quite discriminatory. So we want to improve that as well. So we distributed various channels and materials for those people. At the same time, we saw a surge of domestic violence, so we addressed that as well. And with Zoom meetings, we checked on our members, and especially when there was this coronavirus outbreak in March in Daegu, there was no hospitals that accepted the hospitalization of the disabled people, and at that time, the people with disability groups and activists, they embraced those people in their own facilities. So let me give you an example. So when there was this Itaewon infection, then we sent out text messages to people in that area at that time, but that had no legal ground. It was just pursued by the city of Seoul. So now let's say you send out the messages, whether you were in one of the clubs or whether you were in one of the nearby restaurants. Some people said that this was a better idea. However, disclosing LGBTQ identity and protection of personal information, these two values should be preserved at the same time, and we need to strike a balance between the two. Now, since I don't have enough time, I would like to sum up by saying that in 2014, when we created the Human Rights Charter in Seoul, the mayor of Seoul denied the inclusion of those with LGBTQ people. And at the time, there was some protests. But after the pandemic, the city of Seoul and the activists for LGBTQ came together for cooperation. So at the time, well, if the city of Seoul had been working on their promise that they would protect the rights of LGBTQ, I believe that the outcome would have been different. So going forward, I think we need to focus on how to improve the human rights of the LGBTQ and the alienated people. And I said that the de-institution efforts is now being suspended, but we cannot meet the people in institutions as well as hospitals, as they're not allowed to receive visitors. So our suggestion was that there should be a Wi-Fi connection in those facilities. However, what the government is now doing is they want to pursue these digital care activities, to measure their temperature as well as heartbeat and to provide healthcare professionals in those facilities. However, is this to stabilize the conditions as of now, or is it a journey to achieve the institution at the end of the day? I think that what the Seoul city is doing may undermine the efforts for the institution. So in providing the legal framework for human rights, what we have to be careful that this does not lead to a paradox, and we have to make sure that it receives criticism well and provides a solid framework for human rights. So, of course, it should not be a follow-up measure after the violation of human rights, but it has to be a measure taken in advance so that there is no violation to human rights whatsoever from the get-go. And that is how the Seoul city should cooperate with different agencies to put the human rights of the minority first and to minimize the violation of human rights. And the UN is also accelerating the process towards the institution. So we have to be in line with the UN's work towards the institution and work together with the global community. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. Yes, you talked about what we need to do from the perspective of what the different agencies for women with disabilities and LGBTQ are doing right now, and you kind of diagnosed what was happening in Seoul right now. And you talked about the need for de-institution. The de-institution initiative was now halted due to COVID-19 in Seoul. So you mentioned the need to revive the efforts once again towards the institution. And you also talked about the people in the facilities, maybe in a way being confined in those facilities with no visitors allowed and so forth. So, who are we protecting, and are we not violating their human rights? You posed the questions and the need to revisit the preventive cohort measures. And you also talked about the anonymous testing after the outbreak of coronavirus in Itaewon. And you said that it was an opportunity where the Seoul City worked together with LGBTQ organizations towards that endeavor. And you also mentioned that you want Seoul City to become a human rights city. Thank you very much for that. Next.
공공보건 의료재단 공공의료정책부장
Well, next discussant is Mr. Jung Jae-chul, Senior Research Fellow of Seoul Health Foundation of SMG, and he will talk about the role of a city and the local government in response to a public crisis. Well, good afternoon. As introduced, my name is Jung Jae-chul from Seoul Health Foundation, and we need to have an approach mandating the human rights as our duty. And I also recognize the necessity to be proactive and active in preventing discrimination. And listening to three presentations, I came to understand what kind of political reactions and responses have been made in the midst of COVID-19 to protect the basic rights of human. As you may not know, that Seoul Health Foundation is supporting policies of SMG in the field of response to COVID-19, and even after and before COVID-19, not only infectious diseases, but chronic diseases are contemplated in cooperation with the Seoul City hospitals and medical care facilities so that we can support for structural disease policies. Let me touch upon several tasks in response to the pandemic with the city government. For example, health security is a necessary term for our times. That's what we call health security, widely discussed these days. And health should be a starting point, and policies oriented for health should be in place so that we can reorganize the priorities of policies, focusing on human rights first. And so in one crisis, all advantages of a specific city can change into a dangerous one. And secondly, how we will set up basic rights so that we can protect the lowest level of living. That statement should be redefined and redressed. This was touched upon by previous presentations, but rather than having a standard established by a central government, but we should approach from the perspective of local governments and their duties. And mobilizing resources would differ depending on districts. So the lowest level living expenses can differ from district to district. So using big data or legal profile, healthy gap profiling information should be shared so that we can protect basic rights, basic human rights. And our foundation is developing and reinforcing the development of health profiles. And thirdly, I think partition policy is outdated. Well, this has been addressed by many in the time of crisis. So we should have a comprehensive governmental responses, having close collaboration between central and local governments. For example, I commute from Kuru to Seoul, and then this should be managed in an integrated way because people are moving from one place to another. So we have to have an integrated movement management policy. And fourthly, supply should come first. As you all know, at the forefront of response to COVID-19, in case of Seoul Metropolitan City, 12 city hospitals are responding to the pandemic, and doctors and nurses and administrators are sweating at the forefront of the crisis to respond to the infectious disease, but the shortage of beds and the human resources make them put them into a desperate situation. So we need to make that response system into a stronger one. And let me introduce two activities that we are carrying out. A while ago, we have conducted a kind of discussion entitled the Citizens Vaccine Research Institute. And with 100 citizens, we shared 100 different ideas about how to deal with coronavirus in a wise way. Well, if you look at the elderly, their approach to infectious disease is quite different from the young people. The death rate of COVID-19 affects 25% of the older population, and they try to enhance their immune system by themselves, but they criticize the young people that the young people are not sensitive enough to quarantine, because even if they got infected, they wouldn't die. That's what they think. And I recognized some opposing opinions of these two different age groups. And it was also mentioned by other speakers that there's a rupture of the elderly and the young people, and the elderly especially in facilities with limited visits of their families. And these days, with the closure of child care facilities and kindergartens and working parents ask for the child care from their parents, so the grandparents would take care of their grandkids, and the elderly people complaining about the physical stresses and also mental stresses coming from child care, and listening to their stories and the crisis and the hardship lived from the COVID-19 that's different from the age group. That's what I felt, and that those sufferings are not enoughly shared by different age groups. And one another thing is that, as someone has pointed out, that there are people who cannot take their rest from the work. Seoul is now operating a system since June 2019, the paid leave system, and the central government is now studying this policy so that it will apply this trials as the test project from 2022. And lastly, I would like to make my personal opinions, which is a little bit different from the previous speaker, discussant. Well, we are facing Corona Blue with the increasing rate of suicide of female women and the abuse of the elderly. So isolation and depression are going up, resulting from social distancing, and the abuse of children is increasing as well. But unlike other countries, we have a platform called smartphone, and I am sure that we could take use of these smartphone platforms so that we can listen to the stories and voices of the youth 24 hours and 24, because the youth uses smartphones for a whole day, and this could be a preventive measure to hinder young people to make bad choices. So smart devices can be used as a tool to decrease the aftermath of quarantine. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Dong. You have pointed out 4 areas Well, health and human rights should be put in the center, and from the local governments, actions should be made to protect the basic rights of the underprivileged. And thirdly, city and local governments, not only from the point of view of human rights, but also from other perspectives, should go beyond the partition policies. And as we can see from the shortage of public beds at hospitals, public infrastructures should be strengthened. That was also touched upon by previous presentations. And Citizens Vaccine Research Institutes has allowed a chance to contemplate on the opinions of citizens against the viruses. And I think this could be discussed by others as well. Well, the distanced cares were criticized, and also mental health in coronavirus era. And these are two main challenges that we need to address. And digital platforms were raised as a tool to mitigate these challenges. So if you have any opinions against this, please use the Q&A session. Thank you.
Next, we will hear from Bang Mi-ja, job creation team leader at Seongdong-gu office. You might have heard that Seongdong-gu has actually developed an ordinance to protect the essential workers. So we would like to hear more about that ordinance. Yes, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bang Mi-ja. I'm the job creation team leader at the job policy division at Seongdong-gu office. And if you just joined us, you might think, what is a job creation expert doing here? But then, as someone who took part in the development and enactment of the ordinance, I would like to talk about what we did in that context. First of all, thank you very much for having me here. So I would like to talk about the motivation behind the development of the ordinance, as well as the process of the enactment. And after that, I would like to talk about the initiatives that we carried out after we enacted the ordinance. And lastly, I would like to talk about some areas of improvement. So in April, there was a news coverage about COVID-19 likely to stay with us for a very long time. And of course, since we provide welfare policies to the citizens, we have to place welfare as a high priority. And of course, we were concerned about the spread of the virus, but at the same time, we still had to provide care for the underserved people, because they're the ones, part of our society, as well as workers contributing to the labor force. So that was the motivation behind the ordinance. So of course, we did not use the terminology essential workers from the beginning. However, before we did that, we did some research of global cases, and we came across the terminology essential workers, or key workers, or those who have to work in contact with other people, and those people are called frontline workers. And in Canada, the UK, and the US, many different agencies were discussing how we could protect the essential workers. So of course, we could not adopt and apply what other countries were doing with no change. So we developed our own. So we researched the global cases in May, and from June to July, we came up with a draft ordinance and studied what was happening in Korea. And since we are public officials, so we had some people in our Seongdong-gu office researching who fall under the essential worker category. So they moved around the district to conduct the study. And I myself was part of the team. So we actually cross-checked the occupation table and also the table provided by Seongdong-gu office to define the essential workers. So essential workers would mean that the workers who have to continue to work even in times of crisis such as the pandemic. So that would include welfare, caring, logistics, transportation, medical, as well as building maintenance workers. So we were able to sift through the long list, set the parameters, and we went around to hear what they were doing. So the terminology itself was quite challenging from the beginning, because some people said, are they really essential workers? Are they essential employees, or employees working for essential sectors? So the terminology itself was very difficult. But anyway, we reached the conclusion that anyway, they work in the forward-looking sectors. So at the end of the day, we decided to define them as essential workers. And the process was challenging, but the process helped us enact the ordinance that served as the basis for the ordinance. And of course, since we did not have a high-level law to pass the ordinance, that process itself was also challenging. So the lawmakers asked many challenging questions, such as, isn't this ordinance too challenging, or isn't the target population too vague, and so forth. But anyway, the lawmakers helped us very much to publish the ordinance. But then after we enacted the ordinance, many times public servants stop working because their work is mainly drafting and enacting such ordinance. However, we formed a committee to support the essential workers, and we proposed some of the initiatives that we wanted to do. We went through review, and we are still supporting the essential workers under the ordinance. For instance, we provide safety insurance benefits. So what we do is we give them funds. At the same time, we also help them with psychological treatment or therapy that is conducted by relevant agencies as well as the clinics. And if they want, we also give them the opportunity to get free test of COVID-19. So now we do have some initiatives, but of course we have limitations because we are a self-governing district. We don't have enough budget, and we also have to rely on the high-level laws. But Of course, we wanted to set the institutional framework. That was one of the main ideas behind the ordinance. But at the same time, we wanted to show them respect and gratitude for the essential workers. So at the same time, we conducted a campaign to thank them. And we continue to do so. And last but not least, after we enacted the ordinance, we also came across new limitations because we follow safety-related basic acts as well as employment basic acts. But then as we look at those as reference laws, then we had some limitations in including occupations under the essential worker category. And there's been some challenges raised over that. So we plan to keep making improvements along the way. So we wanted to ensure safety, welfare, and caring services. And we do have a human rights ordinance in Seongdong-gu, and we had to look into whether our ordinance does not conflict with the human rights ordinance. But then for now, we still have a long way to go in that respect. We have to make some revision. So looking back in retrospect, I think that we could cater to the needs of the underserved people's human rights even more. Anyway, after we conducted the survey, so there were many questions raised over, who's the essential workers, and now, we have people in the caring sector, the bus drivers, the logistics, as well as the hospitals and medical, and the building maintenance people. So a total of 6,200 people. If we were to expand that to 25 districts, that's a lot of people. So, of course, our ordinance itself is not perfect, but we plan to make improvements going forward. And since the government and Seoul City tries to do so, we will work together going forward. Yes, thank you very much for that. Ms. Pang Mija, you talked about the ordinance for the essential workers, how it was made. You said that you met people to expand the definition of essential workers. And after the enactment of the ordinance, you also talked about the different initiatives that you are conducting and touched upon the limitations. So the reference law was the employees under the Employment Act. So you said that some people are not protected by the ordinance. So that's one limitation. And you talked about the human rights ordinance laid out by Seongdong-gu. And you also mentioned whether the new ordinance and the existing one are not conflicting, or how you can improve them better. And I think that other district offices as well as central government can look into this example to turn crisis into opportunity. So there are some people who have to keep working even in times of crisis, and we have to get a better understanding of what they do and the risk that they are faced with. And we can use this opportunity to improve even more.
그 청소년분들의 이야기를 들어보려고 해요.
And we're going to listen to two young people this time. First, I would like to invite Ms. Park Seo-bin from Seoul Girls Commercial High School and Deputy Chairman of 5th Seoul Youth Council. Please go ahead. Good afternoon. As introduced, I'm a student from Seoul Girls Commercial High School and also Deputy Chairman of the 5th Seoul Youth Council. My name is Park Seo-bin. In Korea, the participatory activities of the youth and the voice that we make for the protection of human rights. Representing the youth, I would like to talk about some human rights activities that we have been carrying out up until now in the times of COVID-19. From the 2nd January to 15th of January, I have visited China for the voluntary works, and I didn't know about COVID, and I didn't wear a mask even one time during those days. But after returning home, we held one meeting of the youth, and from February, our youth center has closed, and due to COVID-19, everything got closed. In January, I was so excited to the beginning of 2020, looking back on the activities that we did for the year 2019, but everything got just disappeared, and everything we accumulated had been destroyed. And even if we try to start again, and it just got destroyed again, and all our shelters and spaces got closed too. And for the youth, those shelters were the live-away place for the youth who are too much stressed by the studies. But at the center, they shared their own stories with peers, and they had chances to prove their talents. And also, we were able to get energies from counselors, and it was an empowering place for us. But that place got closed due to COVID-19, and we got totally lost asking ourselves what we should do from now on. So being closed in January and February, but we thought that we couldn't just stay there, stopped for everything, and we started our online meeting, and again the second one in March. But actually our initial plan was to meet in person in February to form a steering committee, but it was postponed till the end of March, and we finally decided to do an interview online for the steering committee members. But even after that, we had to continue our online gatherings. And in terms of operation of our community, all offline activities had to get transformed into online ones, like preliminary meetings and plenary meetings, and the contest of youth policy recommendations for SMG, and every other events had to be held online, and some planned ideas of our center, such as events for the youth and for kids, and they also got held online too. And activity kits were delivered to kids and the youth who submitted for the application, and we also made a YouTube video clip so that we can explain how to use the kit. But we did what we were able to do online in earnest. But in the beginning, we were not sure about what we were doing, thinking that this is not something that I've been doing. But there were there are good aspects too to get ready for. We had to count some times for commuting, and we also had friends who had to take care of their own schedules with private academies as well. But having an online meeting meant that we were able to save a lot more time than before, and our internet literacy has enhanced as well. That's what we shared as feedback for having an online meeting. And apart from these good aspects, we also had to face some challenges. We were pressed to have an online meeting even without any gatherings in person, so we felt a bit strange and awkward. But before, we were able to draw better solutions and conclusions having a discussion in person, but online and on a virtual setting, we were more hesitant to propose opinions. And concerning the hours of voluntary activities, online voluntary activities have increased in terms of numbers since April and May. Many youth centers and other institutions have suggested a lot more numerous voluntary activities that can be done online, but these activities were not recognized officially by schools. And for example, our online meetings had to be recorded from A to Z to be recognized as official voluntary activities, but we were not informed of that information, but we just had to give up 10 hours of voluntary activities. And contact-free online voluntary activities got recognized by school deans and presidents from some point of time, but it totally depended on schools and the wills of presidents, and there was no flexibility, and planned activities are not done completely for the year. Well, there are not many activities that we can do by young people, but many hands-on activities and some simple hands-on activities for the elderly and experiential events. All those activities that we were planning got cancelled, and we're not able to complete our plans of the year. Of course, 2020, due to an unexpected COVID-19, we had to wear air masks, and we have been in difficulties. But welcoming 2021, as we have gone through a hard year of 2020, I think that it will be ready more efficiently for the year to come. And let me suggest some things that we have to prepare and some other tasks that the society has to prepare. But it's the first time in 2020 that we discussed the needs of online meetings, so we didn't account for the cost of online meeting organization. And for example, in case of Zoom meeting, if the duration of the meeting goes beyond the 40 minutes, then the free version should have a re-access. But practically, it was not easy to cut the meeting in the middle and re-access the URL. So we need to consider that, and also we need a more a clearer definition of the recognition of hours of voluntary activities, social engagement of the youth, and raising the voice of the youth for the protection of human rights will continue even with masks on. Please listen to our voices so that we can grow as true democratic citizens of this city. Well, thank you very much, Deputy Chairman Park Seo-bin, for sharing your valuable stories about the activities that got stopped due to COVID-19 and turned into online activities, and the voluntary activities were not recognized as official hours of voluntary activities by schools, and the cost which was not accounted from the beginning of organizing meetings, and she also suggested some solutions to that. Thank you.
Now moving on to the last panelist, Mr. Im Jae-young is also Deputy Chairman of the 5th Seoul Youth Council. The floor is yours. Good afternoon. My name is Im Jae-young. I go to Seoul Convention High School, and I'm also Deputy Chairman of the 5th Seoul Youth Council. So, in the face of the pandemic, the youth and the voice of the youth may be neglected, but I appreciate that you have invited us to give you our view on the pandemic. And so we started the school this year online, and at first, teenagers liked it. Well, I liked it too, to participate in the distance learning. However, as this distance learning extended, then students were tired of it. And of course, they do listen to EBS online classes. However, and they also participate in Zoom classes to alleviate the gap of education. So I think the attempt was good. However, now more students are complaining that they're tired of the online classes, and we're seeing less and less activities for the teenagers. Of course, there's this activity for the Seoul Youth Council as well as other types of steering council, and there are some opportunities, but those activities were planned before the pandemic. However, after the pandemic broke out, we are having less opportunities to engage in those activities. And because of the extended online classes, that led to the education gap, which leads to the gap of academic achievement between the students. And there were some students whose academic achievement is at the middle level, and as online classes prolonged, their level of understanding and attention span dropped significantly. So those in the mid-tier were shocked after the first finals in the first semester, after all the classes moved online, because they used to be in the mid-tier. However, their grades just plunged, and they dropped at the bottom of the class. And what's interesting is that those who always did well in terms of academic achievement, they're still in the top tier, but those in the mid tier dropped to the bottom tier, and there is no mid tier. So we only have the top and bottom. So Ms. Park So-bin and myself, we go to special purpose schools, and we see less opportunities for job experience. So of course now it's December, so it's time for the students to go out on the field and have job trainings. However, because of the COVID-19, those opportunities dropped significantly. And as I mentioned, we go to special purpose schools, vocational schools, and we are seeing less and less opportunities to land a job. And of course, there are students who come to our schools and want to pursue a career by going to universities, but most of the students have plans to join the workforce right after the graduation of the high school, but we're seeing less opportunities for that. And to tell you my personal story, I used to participate in many outside activities, such as the Seoul Youth Council. But because of the pandemic, now we cannot do so. We cannot participate in external activities, and we wanted to move the activities online, but because of the lack of promotion and lack of activities and campaigns, that hasn't been easy. So we would like to see more efforts from the Seoul city to provide channels to hear out the voice of the youth and to plan more events for the students. Thank you very much for that. That would be all for me. Yes, thank you very much. So you talked about the minimized opportunities in terms of external activities for the youth, and also you talked about the classes moving online, and also from the perspective of special purpose schools. So you cannot, you have less opportunities to go out and experience the field, and as well have job trainings, and there are some students who are now actually thinking of going to universities as well. Now, we've heard from the 3 speakers and 5 presenters. We are behind schedule, so I think we only have about 10 minutes for the final discussion. So I would like to ask the discussants as well as the speakers for questions, if you have any. And otherwise, we've received some questions and suggestions rather on YouTube, so I would like to mention that first.
Well, the first is about by customs we indicate the gender, but other than that, aren't we supposed to change that existing system into the indication of gender, including LGBTQ? And the second question is about the local currency card. I think this is an opinion related to urban policies. Well, in regards to local currency cards issued by local governments, well, if we could insert some issues of human rights and solutions, and those contents should be inserted as QR code into this local currency card so that we can receive solutions through it. Well, that's what I understood. And do we have any comments to make on these? And yes, can I? Well, Thank you very much for your good opinion. And as far as I understood, and this person just asked if it wouldn't be great to indicate the gender, which should comprise even LGBTQ, not only the conventional gender. But I think it is much more fairer to not to have a gender indication on the resume. But despite of all these concerns, for within the frame of national status registration system, and this is not only needed for the sexually minorities, but amongst the sexual minorities, there are people who do not fall into the category of genders. So in overseas countries, yes, there are several countries equipped with the systems to register the third sex, including Germany. And I think it is practically difficult for local governments to kick off this system on a site, but it is very important to start from contemplation on this matter. And if Seoul City can monitor if there's any sexual discrimination concerning this, and it'll be appreciated, and that could be a starting point. Yes, regarding the comments loaded on YouTube, this sexuality should not be the discriminatory factor for ordinary people to get a job. Thank you very much. If we do not have further comments from YouTube, yes, please. Well, concerning the integration of QR code into a local government currency card, yes, I think that's a great idea to have a link of stories about human rights. Well, that's a great idea. Apart from human rights stories, we can also sit other content into the local currency cards. So the administration and the activities of SMG can transparently be shared with residents. That's a great idea. Thank you. Local currency cards can be a tool for communication with residents. Well, thank you very much. And we have around 6 minutes to go among speakers and discussants. Do you have any further comments that you didn't make during your presentation? I can give you 30 seconds irrespectively. Yes, Mr. Kim?
Yes, so we are here to discuss what Seoul City and local governments can do. And from what I remember, there was a question that I saw even before the conference about the accountability of local governments. Well, of course, we would like to have a king, a very wise king, to direct us towards the right path. You know, if we were living under dictatorship, in a way, it could be more convenient. But then, living as a democratic citizen is no easy task, because when it comes to the quarantine measures, we have to comply with that. And if the government falls short in some areas, we have to voice up. Now, we have participants who have joined us online, and I believe that you are the ones taking great interest in what we are doing at the central and local government level, and you are yourselves the citizens who can really serve as a voice of others who, have no time to join us. And you can actually help local governments move towards the right direction. So I ask you to do that. Thank you.
Let me make one more additional comment into that. Well, amongst all responding activities by SMG against the COVID-19, and personally, the response to Itaewon infection was the most impressive one. And by then, we had been receiving some requests for correction. And during the process, Itaewon infection outbreak got produced, and it got lots of complaints from sexual minorities and LGBTQ associations, and also HIV-related claims were made. So all quarantine managers and human rights managers and our Commission of Human Rights and representatives of sexual minority institutions got gathered together to discuss how this question should be solved, and by not discriminating human rights. So the conclusion drawn from that discussion was to ask questions after the HIV got confirmed, and all announcements and alert SMSs should be delivered in a way not touching upon the sexual identity of the minorities, and the disclosure of the movement of the confirmed people will also be modified with a list of questions, and establishing a hotline to deal with urgent matters between the our commission and the relevant institutions were also discussed. And the human rights related issues derived from the Itaewon outbreak gave us an opportunity or a breakthrough to go beyond the conventional measures. And if that kind of approach is activated, and Seoul will be reborn as human rights city. Well, let me make a short comment on some discussion points. Well, many QR codes are being adopted under the condition that everybody has smartphones, but we found out that the homeless can't have their meals without smartphones. So in a metropolitan area, including Seoul, it is very hard to find areas where Wi-Fi network is not in place. But that's the opposite case in the facilities for the disabled. Infrastructure is discriminatory, and that is getting more and more apparent in emergency and disaster crisis. So digital care adopted by the government means that there should be a real-time monitoring on the basis of health information, and this care cannot be real care, and rather the relationship will be ruptured and rights will be neglected. So smartphone and infrastructures should be revisited so that it can be more helpful for the disabled and underprivileged.
Yes, last but not least, instead of talking about policies, I would like to talk about what we did in September for the essential workers at Cheongdong-gu office. We sent out sanitizers as well as hygiene products, as well as letters and masks to give them words of encouragement. So I would like to read out the message. We encourage you. We appreciate your work, and not only the essential workers, and we would like to encourage everyone in Korea fighting against the pandemic. Thank you very much for that. Yes, so we need to have shelters for the youth as well as the shelters for the children. And the youth centers had to close first when the pandemic broke out. And was that the right action to take? COVID-19 will stay with us for the foreseeable future, and I hope to see the youth center play its original objective. Thank you very much for that.
3시간 반을 좀
Well, for about 3 hours and a half.
동안 아직도 그 캐나다에서 깨어 계신지
For the long time, I'm not sure if Professor Ignaski is still awake in Canada, but all speakers and discussants and viewers via YouTube, thank you very much for your participation. This rounds out the special session of the 2020 Seoul Human Rights Conference. Thank you very much. Yes, Ed said the special session of 2020 Seoul Human Rights Conference is now closed. The title of this is Inequality, Human Rights, and the Role of Local Government in Times of COVID-19. And it was such a fruitful time for all of us to listen to opinions and valuable thoughts of human rights experts from home and abroad. And even if it was a contact-free conference, we were able to share valuable opinions with more people, and that made this conference more graceful and meaningful. And thank you very much, participants from YouTube, for your active engagement. And this conference will also continue tomorrow from 10 o'clock, having thematic sessions from 1 to 3 and general session from 1 to 3. A total of 6 sessions are ready for tomorrow with 2 different language channels, Korean for Seoul City channel in YouTube and English for Seoul City official channel. And you can also download the URL link on our website. Please leave your comments as many as possible. And also we are carrying out a special event for viewers who, if you could upload your picture watching this conference live, and that once the image is uploaded onto an SNS account with hashtag, we will select 100 viewers so that we can provide coffee coupons. And for more details, you can visit our webpage. And we will see you tomorrow once again. Thank you very much. My name is Kim Kyung-mi.